Hello, everyone. I'm Matthew Oxenford, Senior Analyst for Europe and Global Climate Policy at the Economist Intelligence Unit, and welcome to today's session on how to make the best use of the carbon market. Carbon markets can play a significant role in the net zero transition, but right now a lack of consistent high-quality information is holding back demand and investment. Today we want to examine what more can be done to achieve a common framework and methodology for identifying and managing risk in these carbon markets. We want to look at when companies should consider buying offsets and what the correct way might be to communicate this to avoid litigation and reputational risks. Our panel today is a distinguished group of experts from across industry and civil society, including Danielle Laporta, the Global Head of Sustainability and ESG at the Gerald Group, Tanya Lagrasta, the Vice President and Head of ESG at Colliers, Preeti Srivastav, the Group Sustainability Director at Asahi Europe and International, and Mandy Ramparos, the Vice President for Global Cooperation at the Environmental Defense Fund. We want to have an open-ended discussion today, but just sort of to set the stage, I'd like to ask the three panelists from industry to sort of lead off and talk for about 3 minutes as to sort of how does your organization use carbon markets right now, and how has that sort of changed over the last, say, 5 years as carbon markets have become larger, more sophisticated, and also more widely understood by both the public and internal stakeholders. Danielle, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thank you, Matthew, for the introduction, and thank you to Economist Impact for the invitation to participate in today's panel. I'm really glad to be here and to talk a little bit about carbon markets. The good, the bad, and the ugly, right? Lots of controversy and criticism around carbon markets these days. But at Gerald Group, we really believe they have an important role to play in helping us achieve our net zero commitments. That's not to say that it doesn't come with some really big challenges. So before I jump into really what we are doing at Gerald in terms of addressing and using carbon markets to address our climate challenges, so for those of you who don't know, Gerald Group is one of the oldest and largest independent metals trading company, and we are also a mining company. And I want to bring that up because it's important to put that into context, because the mining and metals sector is a highly carbon intensive sector. Today, it accounts for almost 7% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that's just considering our scope 1 and 2 emissions. If we include scope 3, which then primarily, if we're talking about steel and aluminum production, this could raise the contributions of the sector to up to 30%. And I bring that up because it's important to understand the massive challenge the industry has ahead in terms of decarbonizing, and every tool we can use to help us get there is valid and important, right? So the industry is stepping up to the challenge, but it won't happen overnight. As we see, there are a lot of our net zero commitments in the industry are long-term. We are making commitments to be reducing emissions by 2030, by 2050. And that is because it will require massive investments throughout the whole supply chain. So even though the goal is really to be focused on absolute reductions, making the necessary changes in the business models to reduce emissions, carbon credits can and will be an important tool to help us get there. So in terms of what Gerald Group is doing, we are at the very early stages of using carbon markets. So I'm really looking forward to also hearing from other panelists in terms of what their institutions are doing. We just concluded our climate work. We finalized our carbon accounting exercise. We have set a carbon reduction pathway for the group as a whole, but also for our Marampa iron ore project in Sierra Leone, which is our flagship project. So our carbon reduction pathway looks at carbon credits as an important tool to be used alongside our absolute emission reductions interventions. And for that, we really need carbon markets, but we need them to be better and to be more transparent, right? And for us in Marampa, I think I want to introduce here a topic because I think it speaks to the legitimacy and the importance of carbon credits. Is that at our Marampa iron ore project, we intend not only to be acquiring carbon credits from voluntary markets, but also we want to be generating our own carbon credits. And we have a plan in place to do that through our biodiversity offsets projects, and also through our mine closure and rehabilitation program, using nature-based solution and climate-based solutions to be generating these credits to offset these emissions. But as Matthew, you said very well, how do we do that in a way that provides, comfort to all our stakeholders, provides legitimacy in terms of the carbon credits that we are buying from the market, but also generating on site? And I think that a key factor in that is transparency in terms of the methodology that is being used for generating that specific credit, because I think that is one of the key aspects that will be very important in building this confidence from the public and from stakeholders in general. So yes, we will be using carbon credits as an important tool in our to offset some of those emissions that are very hard for us to abate. And we are looking forward to seeing an improved, a new generation of carbon credits that can help mitigate some of that feeling and the criticism that exists today that some of these carbon credits are a bit of a greenwashing attempt. And that, we are looking forward to this new generation of carbon credits where methodology is improved and we have a more confidence in the market in order to help us reach our climate targets. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Danielle. Tanya, do you want to talk a little bit about the impact of carbon credits and how they're being used at Colliers?
Absolutely. Again, as Daniela said, thank you so much for having us. This is a really exciting opportunity and great company with this esteemed panel. So in our work here at Colliers, for those that aren't aware, we are a commercial real estate company specializing in brokerage, valuations, real estate management services, and strategy and consulting for redevelopment and new development projects. And so, for us, I wear two hats, one corporately for what Colliers is doing as part of their operations, and the other side is as practice lead around the ESG and sustainability services that we offer to our commercial real estate clients. And so we're seeing a mix. Corporately, Colliers isn't at that place in our journey. We have, within the last couple of years, set some firm targets around absolute emissions. But as we all know, there are things like residual carbon and elements that we will not be able to eliminate or reduce down to absolutely zero. And at that point, we are open to using high quality offsets, renewable energy credits, whether they're generated on site for us. Is a little less likely given the nature of the space that we occupy and our operations. But for some of our clients, that is something that they are exploring. So we're working with some of our clients who are at the stage in their journey where they're taking a two-pronged approach whereby they are purchasing offsets, whether they're renewable energy credits or carbon offsets, as part of their strategy and moving in step together. Some of them are generating on-site for their own use, so generating on-site renewables to help offset any emissions associated with energy and the like. And others are actually even exploring ways to monetize, so looking at ways to take that and support some additional investments and advancements that they anticipate they will need to be dependent on in the future as they get closer to that period where they are left with things such as residual carbon or having to navigate embodied carbon as part of their buildings. So again, for us, similar to what I'm sure the others will share, it is something that is going to be critical. And I know we'll get into what makes a good offset versus not so good and some of the other nuances. But I think the key takeaway is high quality offsets and using them as part of the strategy. Once we get closer to feeling as if we have made some significant strides in absolute emissions, they are a tool that we will be using, and we expect many of our clients to be using as well.
Great, thanks, Tanya. And then Preeti, do you want to talk a bit about Asahi's view on how they plan to use carbon markets?
Sure, happy to do so. And just for context, Asahi produces beer, so we have about 22 brands in more than 90 markets. Some of you may be familiar with Peroni, Krolsch, Pilsner Urquell, and the likes. And we have a lot of targets around 2030, but we also have a target for 2025 where we want to have 100% renewable electricity. And I think on the electricity side, we're pretty close to reaching the target in 25, but I think there's going to be a big question mark about our 2030 targets, because I think that's where, to Tanya's point as well earlier, that's where the structural changes of actual decarbonization would have been done by us. And our principle as of now is that we will only use offsetting for the last mile, for the bit that we have not been able to decarbonize. But I did want to celebrate the fact that this year, the revenues from carbon taxes and ETS systems hit 100 billion, right? It's a record high ever. And to me, it shows the intent and the appetite. And it is very, very encouraging to see that kind of numbers popping up. But then it leads to the next question of, okay, good numbers, good financing, but how credible and how much of integrity is associated with some of these offsetting? And I think that's where it gets very difficult for us as well. We understand the need for the carbon markets. As a private sector, we actually will be looking at offsetting, but we still are not sure on where we will find the best credible offset instruments. And I think that's a big challenge for a lot of us in the private sector.
Great, thanks, Preeti. I think that's a very good, very comprehensive view of the view from industry across three very different businesses. But now I want to turn to Mandy and sort of have her thoughts on sort of what does the global carbon market look like from the EDF's perspective as a nonprofit that's sort of trying to take a bit of a holistic view as to what needs to be done.
Thanks, Matthew, and thank you also for the invitation and to the wonderful panel and the excellent points that everybody has made. If you're not familiar with the Environmental Defense Fund, we've been working on carbon markets and particularly on the integrity of voluntary carbon markets for a while now, and looking at what would be required in order to have carbon credits of high quality. And when you look at what are the risks that we are facing in the carbon market right now, it's like previous speakers have said, the high risk around integrity. We've been questioned around, are these credits of high value? Do they have integrity? The second thing is around what impact do these projects have in communities and on social elements? And are these actually taken into account? Or are companies just pushing forward with projects in order to meet their offset targets or ambitions that they have? Is there enough collaboration with communities? Is there enough inclusion of communities in developing projects? Or is the focus just decarbonization? So I think it's very clear that when we talk about projects and initiatives that talk to decarbonization, that create carbon credits, you actually need to think about how these projects solve for more than one challenge, because honestly, the communities where we're looking at projects have very high energy poverty issues, energy access issues, environmental health, social elements such as jobs that will all be impacted by some of these decarbonization projects we talk about. So you actually need to look at projects that will solve for all of this in order to also have integrity in your carbon emissions. So it's not just about ensuring there's proper accounting, but also ensuring you're taking care of these issues that impact on your projects. There are a lot of frameworks in existence now that have recently come to light that can help with this, that gives guidance. And taken together, these frameworks can really be seen as companies sending a strong signal that the direction of travel for ambitious net zero goals is actually quite holistic. So having science-based targets is one of the most important things, I think, for companies to illustrate their commitment to integrity, their commitment to targets and to emissions reductions that are over and above business as usual. We don't even talk about business as usual anymore because we need to go beyond that. We need to go beyond our value chain emissions. Things like the UN-backed Zero campaign, the UN's high-level expert group on net zero emission commitments for non-state entities. There's a number of frameworks in place. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the Integrity Councils for voluntary carbon markets have recently released its core carbon principles, and that sets the global threshold to define what high integrity carbon credits look like. Similarly, we have the Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative's Code of Practice that also provides a set of prerequisites for companies to achieve before they can make these claims. So I think what's very important is that we are all very positive advocates for the carbon market. We all want to see this work. We know it's a very important tool in our toolbox of achieving the reductions we require to get us on track according to the Paris goals. But we need to deal with the integrity around it. We need to deal with the controversy around it and be very clear. And then I think the last thing I want to say is from a company perspective, it's extremely important to be transparent. The transparency requirements from the voluntary carbon market, from these various frameworks I'm talking about, but also with the compliance market with Article 6. Previous to my role at EDF, I negotiated Article 6 for South Africa for many years. And the most important thing that came out of that was you need to be transparent. So your reporting, your accounting, your transparency all points towards the integrity of your carbon market. And the last guide I think companies can use is the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative that actually helps you assess your carbon projects and does have this holistic lens of looking at the social impacts, the environmental impacts, and bringing these together in what makes a high quality carbon credit. Thank you, Matthew. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mandy. I think there's a lot of really interesting themes that have come out of this discussion so far. Obviously, the question of integrity and what makes for a good offset is something that every member of the panel has been brought up. Mandy's point about the importance of making sure that other societal implications, the S and the G, as well as other bits of the E, are also incorporated into these markets. And then also the question of what is the right balance between private initiative and international standards. So I want to get to all of these. So Danielle, you had talked about sort of developing your own offset system, and you've really stressed the question of integrity and what makes for a credible voluntary carbon offset. Do you want to sort of take us into a bit more detail? Because I know this has been something that everyone's talked about on the panel, and it would be interesting to hear your institution's view on how you're going to try and make this credible.
Yes, I think that's a great question, Matthew, and one that we've been struggling with a little. In terms of using carbon credits for our own purposes. I mean, if we look at what's in the press these days, there's a lot of questioning around the methodology on how these credits are being generated, right? And I think Mandy spoke about the key issue here, which is transparency. And I think that these criticisms are very important because it brings the topic up for discussion, and it forces us to be a bit more forceful in bringing this transparency to the carbon markets. So I think the criticism is very welcome, and for us, this transparency will help and enable us to select the high value carbon credits, which is what we want, right? We want to make sure that when we are offsetting, for example, our emissions associated to our iron ore operation in Sierra Leone, that we're not buying carbon credits that are located somewhere else in the globe that have absolutely no connection to our project, no connection to the country where we're operating, no connection to our communities. So for us, this transparency, I think, is going to be key in enabling us to feel confident to be using the carbon credits as this important tool that it is to help offset some of our emissions. So for us, this is also valid for our own ambitions in terms of generating our carbon credits. When we're, a lot of the criticism that we're seeing today in this space has to do with the REDD+ credits, right? And the methodology and how we are assessing these credits and what efficacy they're really bringing in terms of generating conservation. In the mining sector, this kind of criticism is a bit less relevant because our baseline is very well established. We know exactly what the deforestation patterns would be for a mining project, for example. And so that gives us the confidence that when we're using this nature-based and nature climate solutions, and if we are being transparent, that we will be generating these really high quality carbon credits that are reliable, transparent, and bring integrity to the process.
Thanks. Preeti, you had also mentioned sort of the importance of transparency and integrity and how you sort of view the offset market. Do you want to sort of expand on this a bit?
Yeah, sure. Honestly, I feel like if you look at the voluntary carbon market, it operates outside of the government mandated carbon markets, right? So in terms of regulation, especially for a lot of global companies, in terms of regulation, we are looking at totally different accreditation bodies depending on which geography it's sitting in, depending on where the actual project is happening vis-a-vis where the middle carbon offsetting secretariat is sitting. It's a very complicated system right now. And I think for all of us, be it private, public, or nonprofit sector, we just need three things: clarity on how these projects are operating in which geography, the credibility of that, how it maps to the NDCs, how it maps to the Paris Agreement, and then also showing how it has the positive environmental impact and tonnage of CO2, very clear. And also it has what is the potential social impact, including human rights, including rights of indigenous peoples. And at the same time, the final bit, I know it's a big ask and I'm adding more and more elements to it, but the final ask would be to have clarity on the accounting itself so that we are not double counting it. So I think given that there are so many ambiguous questions floating around there, clearly the answer is there's not enough regulation and there's not enough work done on the carbon markets for anybody to be able to clearly and confidently say that, yes, I'm buying these offsets and I'm sure where they're coming from and the impact that they're making.
Thanks, Preeti. Mandy, do you want to come in on this? I know you've been talking in your opening statement about sort of how these international standards and norms are being developed. Do you agree with Preeti that those are the things that are really needed? And is this something where the private sector is just going to have to wait, or how can they sort of innovate as this ecosystem continues to evolve?
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. And I think it becomes a little confusing also for the private sector because you have ICVCM, you have VCMI, you have CCQI, so you have an alphabet soup actually that you have to deal with over and above the transparency and the integrity and the accounting that you need to do. So what we've been encouraging is for these things to also come together to provide the correct guidance. And so I think we're seeing a lot more congruency between the Science-Based Target Initiative, speaking very much with the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative and the Voluntary Carbon Market Codes of Practice. So there is quite a lot of discussion between these bodies and how they can impact in a positive way to provide the right guidance without being too onerous to companies. And so one of the things we've been encouraging is let's just be clear on what the requirements are. Let's be clear on whether these are meeting what the risks are so that companies can confidently deal with the risks. So I absolutely agree with that. We need a coming together. But I do think that the way we communicate also about these the transparency, the way we communicate about the risks and showing that we actually understand the risk is very important, especially since we're seeing more and more legal challenges now around greenwashing. So you do see now there's increased regulatory scrutiny of the voluntary carbon markets, in the US, where there's a need now for disclosure to the various bodies in the on a regulatory basis. So I think if companies do adhere to these standards and codes of practice that are coming out, we will go a long way to meeting these requirements. But I also agree, the initial point that these frameworks do need to come together so that we remove some of the confusion as well in terms of what defines a good carbon credit.
Thanks, Mandy. I think that there's pretty broad agreement from the nodding of heads that I've seen in terms of what needs to be done in terms of regulatory standardization, providing one set of rules that addresses some of these issues like double counting. But just to sort of talk a bit about sort of how companies can operate in the world we live in now, Tanya, do you want to come in a bit on reputational risk and the litigation risk that you face as somebody who's dealing with a lot of counterparties that are using carbon credits in different ways? How do you see the best way for the private sector to minimize the litigation reputational risk of what's right now still a very decentralized system?
Happy to. Thank you. It's much of what we've talked about is there's really no way to guarantee or eliminate or ensure that companies aren't going to get it wrong or have a little misstep or. So I think it's about what we can do to limit and or openly de-risk or reduce risk with respect to litigation, and sometimes even what takes a company down before it actually gets its day in court is the court of public opinion and the reputational risk, which sometimes isn't identified as a core risk, but I've seen the problems that it can cause. So I think Mandy's shared this. A few others have spoken to it. I really believe that it comes down to how you communicate the use of carbon credits. And that's both, in terms of oral communication. So if anyone's at a podium talking about it, making sure that they're fully up to speed, or we don't have people who are not positioned well or don't have the technical acumen holding those, having those conversations. As well as the written text. And so, a couple, three themes, we've talked about them, but just to kind of summarize them from a communications perspective that will help avoid litigation risk is really around transparency, accuracy, and accountability. So what does that kind of sort of look and feel like? So again, disclose how you calculate your footprint, be transparent, be open around what types of carbon credits you're purchasing, where you're sourcing them from, your governance process to the extent that you can ensure their quality and additionality, and then also how you're retiring from the market, and to the extent possible, provide and or have evidence on hand to be able to document and support your claims and calculations. Another big watch out here is what I've experienced is, working in a bit of a triad situation where you've got, your ESG kind of technical team who's leading these decisions and influencing these decisions, your legal team as your counsel, and then you have the communications and the PR teams. And what I have found is I put something into the machine alongside with legal, and sometimes in a genuine effort just to have things read nicer, sometimes your communication teams, unbeknownst to them, can actually compromise the factual integrity of what you have tried to articulate, because it can kind of seem a bit clunky for a comms person. So making sure you have checks and balances and ensuring that from a technical review, that after it's gone through the communications machine, that you are giving it a final technical review, because those things do happen. Again, obvious, kind of, but avoid making misleading or substantiated claims about your carbon neutrality and net zero status based on offsetting alone. So acknowledging, again, it's been talked about, acknowledging the limitations and uncertainties of offsets, the market, and being transparent and authentic with those limitations around the need for continuous improvement, innovation in the field, and then be seen doing something to improve it, not just standing on the sidelines and pointing criticism, but actually, if you fundamentally believe that this is an effective mechanism, companies and leaders globally, nationally, regionally should be playing an active role in advancing this, not just waiting for it to happen, because it won't. We've talked about this, following relevant guidelines, global, international, as well as regional and local, and using what's been making some really great progress, which gives me confidence around the carbon markets, is what's been happening around the standardization of ESG reporting globally. So looking to those as vehicles that are increasingly becoming trusted ways of communicating. And then, again, we've talked about this before, but engage with your stakeholders. Engage with regulators, investors, your customers, suppliers, your employees, nonprofit groups on your carbon offset strategy, your performance, and again, back to my earlier comment around supporting efforts for continuous improvement, actively participating through those stakeholder options to do so. I'll stop there and pass it back over to you, Matthew.
Great, thanks, Tanya. That was very comprehensive. There's a lot of different directions we can go with this. I want to talk a little bit more about sort of how the space, how we see the space evolving in terms of engaging with stakeholders. Preeti, you mentioned sort of earlier in the conversation about how you see the regulatory and the regulatory issues around accountability and transparency evolving. What are the key things you're looking out for in terms of engaging with stakeholders, particularly in the public sector, as things move forward?
I think when we talk about stakeholders, and I know we've been talking a lot about carbon markets, almost equivalent to offsetting. I think there is a very big part of carbon markets, which is the internal carbon pricing or external carbon pricing. And that is a very powerful instrument that we are using to engage with stakeholders. So we have an internal carbon price, and we actually have come up with something called sustainable EBITDA. So we take our EBITDA and we subtract the carbon price from it, and that EBITDA is what we use for making CapEx decisions, for all the investment conversations. And finally, we also now have attached our leadership incentive schemes to the EBITDA and the internal carbon pricing. So I think using not just the offsetting mechanism, there are multiple instruments in the carbon markets to utilize which is the right one for which stakeholder. I think internal carbon pricing is a good one to engage with employees, to engage with investors, to engage with your board and senior management. Externally, I do agree with everything that is being said. And I do believe that the carbon markets, or specifically offsetting market, can do a lot of good. However, I do think that it is important to make structural changes within the company before we look at the offsetting piece, right? And I think that's why I'm highly appreciative of science-based targets, for example, that says that you actually cannot use just offsetting mechanisms. You have to show how you actually remove it. I know there is a huge need for climate financing, and offsetting is one of the instruments that will lead to that. But I do think there has been a big surge in the private sector to say, in the beverage sector as well, there are multiple examples where you see a product that has a logo that says we are carbon neutral. And when you actually look at the fine print, it is 90% through offsetting, right? And there are no regulations around that, around product claims. There are no regulations around that. It is accepted right now, even if you have a 90% offsetting to make a product supposedly green. So I think when we talk about stakeholders, if you're talking about governments and policymakers, I welcome policies like CSRD. I welcome the debate in the European Parliament on potentially banning claims like carbon neutral or net zero, because they're just creating a mess in terms of what it really means. What I think is important as a company is to be able to participate in some of these consultations and conversations and share that point of view with all the stakeholders. So we are sharing it with our consumers as well. There are multiple products where we have QR codes where a consumer can actually scan that code and read everything related to carbon associated with that product. And we are not putting in any claim there because it's still up for discussion. We don't know. There is no scientific calculation around it either. So I think depending on which stakeholder, we need to look beyond offsetting. We need to look at different instruments in the carbon market to engage with them. Secondly, I think when we talk about speaking with public bodies or regulatory bodies, I think it's high time we have a little bit more regulation around brand mapping and brand claims and product claims as well, and how offsetting factors into that. I'll stop there, Matthew.
Great, thanks. Mandy, I just want to bring you in this conversation in terms of sort of how this question of what constitutes an acceptable offset or an effective offset is developing. Where do you see the regulatory environment going in the next few years globally and in key markets?
Great, thanks, Matthew. Great question and great points that were just made by Preeti on these claims. The VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative, has developed these codes of conduct that came out recently, codes of practice, that were recently published. But in my view, it didn't go far enough. They are continuing to develop work on the claims code, so that's work in progress. But I really do think we need to push strongly on that. So that together with the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative guide, but again, it's just guidance, right? It's not mandatory. Those things, if companies put that in practice, it would actually go a long way to verifying the integrity of your carbon credits. But we don't have them yet. They still need to be developed. They're still in development phase. So I do think we need to accelerate on that because companies can't sit back and wait for that to happen. It has to happen quickly, push that. From a regulatory standpoint, my personal opinion and vision or aspiration is that the voluntary market and the compliance market someday need to come together. We need to have one market because what's going on right now is that we have disparate carbon markets and disparate ways of regulation. So you find that the compliance market credits have a higher price and people then start questioning, why is that? Is that because the voluntary carbon market is not regulated enough? So I do think we do need this regulation to bring that integrity into the marketplace that companies need to adhere to. And like I said earlier, though, we need to strike the right balance. It can't be so onerous that you actually push people away from the carbon market. So we do need to bring that together. So that's where I see it going. These claim codes being developed in detail, and then these voluntary and carbon markets coming together so that we don't have disparate ways of looking at how we regulate these markets.
Thanks, Mandy. We have a bit more than a minute left, so I'd like to just sort of bring this all to a conclusion. I think there's been quite a lot of agreement on this panel across a variety of different discussions, and I think we could have gone on for another 40 minutes if we'd had the time. I think some of the key points that I'd just like to highlight is this issue of the alphabet soup of different standards and how at some point there should be more standardization and that would benefit both the voluntary and the compliance-based markets as that sort of moves forward and is developed. In terms of what the private sector can do in the meantime, I think Tanya's point about integrity, transparency, and accountability was a very good way of framing it, that having high quality, sort of well disclosed and well understood explanations of what offsets or of what the strategy for using offsets is going to be is critical for moving forward. Any sort of strategy for using carbon markets in part of the of private sector's decarbonization strategy. And I think also that some of the questions around sort of how you achieve public buy-in for all of this and how it sort of feeds into the larger question just beyond just decarbonization, but into social and economic and biodiversity concerns are also quite critical. So with that, I'd like to thank our distinguished panel, Danielle, Tanya, Preeti, and Mandy, for what was a very stimulating discussion, and I hope that you look forward to the next session. Thank you so much.